Martin Luther? And why should we study about Martin Luther? And what are we to make of this movement, Protestantism, that he caused necessarily? Just who is Martin Luther? So we've got to do some introductions and some assertions. The History Channel named him as one of the most important people throughout history. The New Yorker has also echoed in a write-up declaring that the Reformation, the movement Luther sparked, the Reformation in turn reshaped Europe, and an eighth of the human race is now Protestant because of that. Luther was also noted for being the third most important person of the past millennium in a Life magazine write-up, I remember, right after Columbus and Edison. You can think about the electrification that is really important, the phonograph, and Columbus, but beating out Da Vinci and Galileo. So, still, we don't really know who he is. We can be forgiven for not knowing who Martin Luther is. In a recent poll, 2/3 of respondents knew that Luther kicked off the Protestant Reformation. But they had been given 3 choices. Entering a search into Google appears to bring up Martin Luther King Jr. more often than Martin Luther. And I recall an incident where I was at a Lutheran school, and a young man, I was talking to him about writing this paper on Martin Luther, and he thought I meant Martin Luther King Jr., and then I said, no, the German reformer. Who's that? So we don't really know who Luther is. So just who is Luther for us today, especially in our world? Does it really matter in this post-Christendom world, so far removed from the issues that Luther was facing? What can we say about Luther? So I came across this video.
500 years ago, on October 31st, 1517, a German Catholic monk by the name of Martin Luther posted some complaints he had about the Catholic Church on a church door in Wittenberg, Germany. Luther was upset by the church practice of selling what were known as indulgences to wealthy patrons. Indulgences might be loosely described as get-out-of-hell free cards. Pay this amount to the church, and the church would make sure you don't suffer unduly for your sins in the hereafter. Luther felt very strongly that the practice not only made the church look bad in the eyes of the common people, but had no scriptural basis. He believed the church needed to reform itself or would lose its legitimacy. Nobody, including Luther, thought that his complaints, and he had made a list of 95 of them, would amount to much. He simply wanted to spark a discussion on an issue that deeply concerned him. Instead, he set off a chain reaction that literally changed the course of history. The name we give to this change is the Protestant Reformation. Had Luther limited his criticism of the church to indulgences, as his friend, the Dutch scholar Erasmus, urged him to do, the matter might have been resolved and the old order preserved. But the headstrong Luther was not someone to be restrained. Luther was what we would call today a flawed individual. He was brilliant and charismatic, but he was also vindictive and stubborn to a fault, and at the end of his life, sadly, anti-Semitic. Luther believed there should be no separation between the Bible and the believer. Every individual should have access to the Word of God, Luther contended, as any priest did, or even the Pope. We take this view for granted now, but in the 16th century it was a radical concept. And here's why. For more than 1,000 years, the Church had been the dominant religious and political authority in Europe. It alone taught Christians how to understand the Bible. Luther was now challenging the very basis of this authority. Not surprisingly, the Church didn't take it well. What began as a squabble between a bold monk and the Catholic hierarchy soon developed into a titanic and bloody struggle that split Europe into opposing religious factions. But the consequences of Luther's ideas extended far beyond a religious dispute. It's not an exaggeration to say that as a result of Luther's ideas, the modern individual was born, a free actor, endowed with God-given rights that exist independent of government or any other institution. Each person could find those rights by reading and interpreting the Bible for himself. Of course, to do that, you had to be able to read the Bible, And throughout the first millennium, right up until Luther's day, only a very few people could. Books, including the Bible, were all handwritten, a process usually that took months. This made books rare and expensive. Furthermore, most Bibles were written in Latin, the language of the church, a language familiar only to the clergy and educated elite. This exclusivity was one of the many ways in which the church maintained its power. Luther answered this problem by translating the Bible into everyday German so that anyone could read it. But his efforts would all have been for naught except for the recent invention of the printing press by a fellow German, Johannes Gutenberg. The printing press allowed for the first time in history books, and soon thereafter pamphlets and newspapers, to be widely distributed. Without the printing press, Luther would have likely suffered the same grim fate of other reformers before him, like Jan Hus, who was tried, convicted of heresy, and burned at the stake. But because of the printing press, Luther's movement could not be stopped, and indeed could not be controlled. Bloody religious wars between Catholic and Protestant forces quickly followed on the heels of Luther's new ideas. They lasted for 200 years and cost countless lives. The 30 Years' War alone from 1618 to 1648 is reputed to have led to about 8 million deaths from fighting, famine, and disease. But out of all this carnage, many positive changes came too. The Protestant empowerment of the individual led to capitalism and the Enlightenment, just to name two byproducts of Luther's protest. The American Revolution, with its idea that individuals endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights should be free to form their own government, was another. Of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, all but one was a Protestant. Pronouncing a verdict on an epoch as significant as the Reformation is very difficult. Perhaps it's best not even to try. But we can say this: no other single figure made more of an impact on the modern world than the German monk, Martin Luther. And even he would be surprised to know that.
And everything he said was virtually incorrect. The reason I bring that up is because this was the story that I was taught. It's the story that Luther boldly sets out to go ahead and destroy those evil Catholics and all their nefarious ways. This is a common story, and it's almost wrong completely across the board. We are not sure that Luther, number one, posted his complaints on the door at Wittenberg. He only recalls that years after it's happened, and it's entered into a mythos. What we do know is that he sent it on to his archbishop, the Archbishop of Mainz, Albrecht. And these complaints were not for an argument, but for clarifications about the sale of indulgences. 95 questions about, okay, have you thought through what indulgences are? And we will talk about this. Indulgences didn't work that way. They were not a get-out-of-hell-free card. We'll talk more about that later on, but briefly put, indulgences allowed the person, they had been started in the medieval church to allow fighters to go and fight to protect Christian lands and be given a dispensation against the purging of their sins in a place that became known as purgatory later on. And what this said was, you're fighting because you're fighting for the Lord. We're giving you this piece of paper to show that because you're fighting for the Lord, your sins are going to not count against you for doing this fighting, even though fighting is usually wrong. Okay, well, what happens if you can't fight? Okay, well, you can show that you have a changed heart, and the way you show that you have a changed heart is if you pay for it. Over the years, it became a notion that you would go to purgatory, not hell. It did not get you out of hell. It would save a person who was destined for purgatory for so many years. And they got into this huge, complex calculus about it. Erasmus did not limit his complaints to indulgences only. Erasmus complained about all sorts of things in the Roman Catholic Church. Erasmus was one of the people who was a reformer before Luther was. And he was certainly not one of Luther's friends. They hated one another bitterly. And ironically, this was not really Luther's fault. Erasmus was the one who hated Luther more than Luther hated Erasmus, which did not always work that way. The church held on to its right to interpret and therefore read Scripture because it turns out rightly afraid of what would happen if anyone was allowed the Bible. And we've seen what happens when people are given the Bible. We've seen horrible translations. We've seen horrible things done. The prosperity gospel and Jim Jones and all sorts of the Branch Davidians over and over again. We see what happens when you don't have proper understanding of the Bible. And so the Catholic Church got around this by saying, we'll interpret the Bible because it's very powerful. This is the most powerful thing in the universe, and we can't just hand it over to anyone. And Luther said, no, we've got to trust people because they're going to make mistakes, but they're also going to get closer to God too. And so the argument wasn't so much an argument of control of power per se, but what would happen when that power was wielded by people who may not be the best at wielding it. They feared the risks, the Roman Catholic Church, more than the benefits. The modern individual, the Catholic Church was far more concerned, and still is more concerned, with free will than Luther, because Lutherans don't believe in free will. Free will is still a major tenet in the Catholic theology, and we'll go over that too, and is not held by Lutherans or by Calvinists. Luther himself got into a bitter argument with that same Erasmus over free will. Rights language is a secular concept that will emerge as people attempt to bind the powerful to their responsibilities as rulers. Luther once said, suffering, cross is the right of the Christian. Hardly a ringing endorsement for free will. The printing press did unleash wild ideas, again giving justification to Catholics' greatest fears, but the so-called wars of religion were really the first great stirrings of larger European nationalism, only paying lip service to religion as a scapegoat. 3 examples should suffice. France was the main backer of the Protestants. France, a Roman Catholic country, was the main backer of Protestants during the 30 Years' War. The principal advisor of the Calvinist elector of Brandenburg was a Catholic. In March 1635, the troops of fervently Catholic Spain attacked Trier, a Catholic city, kidnapping the Catholic Archbishop Elector. Catholic France subsequently declared war on Catholic Spain. None of this seems to suggest religion played into the reasons for a war, but was merely a fig leaf to cover over a nation-state's power grab. So capitalism, the Enlightenment, the Reformation with Luther's spark did not lead to things, but either marked their passage, wrong there, or slightly redirected their movement, correct there. Capitalism was already booming by the so-called High Middle Ages, and would in fact be restrained by the same forces that would try to domesticate Protestantism. The Enlightenment is a mixed bag of positives and negatives. It would lead to the scientific method and shared sense of a world community, but it would also usher in the greatest devastation of wars, from the French Revolution to the Russian Revolution and the World War IIs in between. For good and for ill, the Reformation was only tangentially connected to it. In a wonderful overview, economic sociologist Douglas Rushkoff points out the Middle Ages saw greater economic output, but it would be monarchs who were fearful and jealous, and so they tried to capture. We'll kind of talk about that a little bit. Protestant churches were then used as a way to displace or replace the Roman Catholics as a power of Europe. And that's just more information saying. So let me kind of go back to this. There's a gentleman by the name of Max Weber. Weber wrote this this book, which is still cited by people today, and it's completely wrong. But Weber talks about the Protestant work ethic. But the thing was, that notion was shaped more by Weber, who was a German, understanding of national pride than it was good, rigorous historical understanding, because the Catholic countries were also very dominant economically, and really we see full-scale capitalism emerging in the High Middle Ages. So it wasn't that Protestantism created capitalism, but rather it just took it to a different direction than its Southern European neighbors.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Okay. The people that made that little film, they probably thought it was right.
Yeah.
So how do we know it's really wrong?
Because the gentleman who spoke that was probably someone who went to school at a time before a lot of Catholics were bringing in their viewpoints. We've had a lot of Catholics kind of come in and share. A lot of those higher educational institutions were cut off. Catholics didn't study there, and we didn't really talk about that. This was a time also when America was fighting a Cold War, and so we needed to say why our institutions were better than other people's institutions. Now, we then went through a period where everyone rebelled, and we actually see some of that in other people's writings. Brad S. Gregory is probably the most famous. He's good to read, but I disagree with his critiques, where Protestantism is considered either a negligible thing or something that was just terrible and horrendous for the church. And so where we've gotten now, as we've kind of analyzed the data, is that we see there are longer trends, and what Luther was a continuation. And we're going to kind of get to that in a bit. But the problem there with that video is this was the kind of stuff I was raised on. Roland H. Bainton, who wrote a really wonderful book, Here I Stand, you can kind of hear echoes of that thinking. And that'll be the dominant thinking in academia really up until about 1980s. It'll shift over into a revisionist history where people are attacking Protestantism. And then it's going to go back, and we've hit kind of an equilibrium where people understand Luther as both the product but also kind of the hinge from one way of thinking to the other. Now, don't get me wrong, Luther is an important individual, and he certainly is one of the most important, and one could make an argument, the most important person of the post-apostolic father age. He is really, for the past 1700 years, probably the most important person. But the reasons I want to point out is because a lot of times we see these things through the lenses of the nation state, and especially the Protestant nation state. And what we need to start looking at them through is the lens of a Christian. Why is Luther important for Christianity? Because only when we see when Luther is important for Christianity will he become important for all the other aspects. And his thinking is important for all the other aspects. Does that help out?
No.
No? Okay.
Okay. That was way too much information.
Oh, yeah. So, anyway, that's just more and more of that. Unfortunately, this is like my wheelhouse. This is like what I love talking about. So we must first get away from the notion of trying to measure Luther based on what we want to see, and see him for what he stood for. And I think that was the problem with the video. The big problem with the video is trying to make Luther stand for things Luther wasn't standing for. And when we get away from that, when we stop trying to make Luther stand for the things we want him to stand for, then we can really understand the cataclysmic, revolutionary quality that Luther was able to usher in on the world. We must ask ourselves, did Luther accomplish his goals, or did he leave the world in a worse place than he found it? Luther wanted to reform the church. Some, as the Catholic historian Brad Gregory pointed out, say the church is now more divided than it was. Certainly, there are thousands of Protestant denominations out there. The state was able to pick up more control at the church's expense. And individuals saw themselves as judges over a shared Christian story, which means if I tell you, the Bible says this, you can tell me, no, that's not what I see in the Bible. And I guess we're both equally valid, even if you've gotten a degree on it and I'm not. So the question then is, does Luther solve these? But again, these are things we're trying to put on him. So in other words, Enlightenment writers wish to present themselves as the only people who draw on older sources. So the Enlightenment comes in, and the Enlightenment creates this notion that the Enlightenment creates the medieval period. And they say, until we showed up, everyone was in the Dark Ages. Now we're in this Enlightenment period. But again, it's a myth. This confuses the church as institution with the church as a gathering of believers. The institution had become corrupt, and no one could ignore that, but people were yearning to take part in their faith. Protestants as well as Catholics would take up that call. Initially, the Catholics resisted, but Protestants began to get traction. Reformers in the Catholic Church were able to implement the necessary changes. So what caused the Reformation? And this will take up the rest of the time together. Changes in people's lives, changes in culture, and inability of the church to keep up. So the High Middle Ages, which occurred to roughly ended about the year 1300, are followed by incredible hardships. Now, the population of Europe has tripled by the year 1300, and it's booming. They've had fantastic harvests for 2 centuries. And what is happening now is they enter into a period of tremendous famine. This is something we don't understand today, because today, we have so much, we've got food, and we can augment our problems of our food by going in and, fertilizers and so forth. We have a very stable food source. In fact, even the poorest countries, the only thing that causes famine now, these days, is if there's war. That's it. Before it was poor rains, we had this, we had that. We still had plenty of food. And so Europe faces this tremendous famine. Wars soon follow. Because if you're a powerful lord, you're going to want to try and get more food, and the best way to get more food is to get war. And if you're a peasant, you might as well join the army and conquer a place so that you can get their food. So war follows on famine. This is something we see today. And then, or we saw several years ago, and then in 1347, the Black Death will emerge in the port of Genoa. And it will wipe out 30% of Europe's population before it's through. It will come over and over and over again. And it is so constant and so pervasive in the mind of Europeans that it still has a psychological impact on us today. Remember a few days ago I told you about Ring Around the Rosie, how that was a little chant to tell you that the Black Death was coming and it was going to kill you. And we face this pictures emerge. Wills, this is the time when wills and testaments become more popular for everybody, because you just never know when you're going to die. This led to asking questions about God's plans. What are God's plans in my life? And it doesn't seem like these are being answered like they used to be. You know, when things are going well, I don't know about you, but for me, when things are going well, God can stay on his side of the fence just fine. When things are going bad, that drives you to your knees. And so people start asking questions of God, and where do they go? They go through the church. But here's the problem, and we'll get to this in a moment. The church is incapable of dealing with a Europe in crisis, which causes people to start looking elsewhere. The church failed to adapt to the new situation, and people began to look elsewhere. They began, this led to disillusionment with the structures. The church is now, we're calling into question, I'm sick, I go to my priest. My priest can't help me. My priest doesn't know what to do. Obviously, I need to start looking for answers on my own, because the people that were supposed to supply me with answers aren't doing their job. This sees the growth in Renaissance humanism. Now, this is not what we think of as humanism today. It sought two things: the flourishing of able-bodied men to become their best selves, and the idea of going back to the fountain. So what it is it's a mixture of rigorous self-improvement. I mean, we all know the Renaissance man, the person that can do anything and everything. This is when the average person, and not just a clergy member, is going and they are looking and they are checking things out for themselves. They're starting to do experimentation. They are starting to look into the natural world and break things down that way. But they're also going back to the Greco-Roman culture, because they understood that was a time of high culture. It was a time that they thought was this bright, shining light before everything went dark in the Dark Ages. This is also the time when you see what they call confraternities. These are very important. I didn't know about these till a few years ago. Confraternities were groups of lay people that kind of got together and they did things. They were kind of like they could be men's clubs for like wheelwrights and so forth, guilds a lot of times, but they also had a spiritual aspect to them. And because a lot of these lay people felt shut out from the church, but they were still looking for answers, they did what they knew only thing they knew how to do, which was to organize themselves with people who worked in the same kind of fields they did, or ended up living in the same places they did, and organize themselves as prayer meetings at this time. So this is the growth of the confraternities. It is also a more pronounced reliance upon the natural world. As people move away, most of us, if we got sick, really sick, wouldn't say, you know what, I'm not going to the doctor's office because that, my spirituality will fix that. This is the point where Europeans start to accept the fact that God works within the natural system as well as in the supernatural system in prayer. There are a lot of things that come from this crisis, and this crisis completely changes the European mindset. And so we come to the end of that point. Let me go back. So, changes in culture that emerge at this point then. So now we're having the Renaissance, and Renaissance humanism is emerging. Renaissance humanism is so important for us to understand because it lays the foundation of the natural world that we think of today. And also, another thing that's happening as these academics are going and studying in schools, how did they get there? Why did people all of a sudden start going to universities? Well, what happened was, in the High Middle Ages, that period right before the Renaissance occurs, in the High Middle Ages, who is the dominant powerhouse in Europe?
Church.
The church. No king is able to counteract the church. No king is strong enough to go against the church. And in fact, all of these little kingdoms are broken down smaller and smaller pieces, and we're told that that is, oh, that's a terrible disorder. Well, it is if you're a monarch. But what happens if you're not a monarch? What happens if you're a merchant? Well, you might have to pay tolls here and there. But if you're a merchant, the borders are a lot more fluid, because everything's controlled by one unified governing organization, the church. And with that, we start seeing merchants making more and more money. This is the time when the burghers, which are named as people who live in the burgs, city dwellers, are emerging. This is a time when unrestrained capitalism is emerging because traders are going everywhere. What's interesting is if we look at the records, we see that people are trading less precious goods. And we used to think, well, that's crazy. They're trading these less precious goods, so that means they must be poor. It's not. We just look at it today. Look in our own society. You know, if someone's trading nothing but high value goods, and there aren't that many of them, are they richer than a society where you've got grocery stores, where you've got television sets? So what's happening is you're seeing a growth in middle class goods rising. There is a lot more I'd like to talk about here, but suffice it to say, the nobility see that they're starting to lose power. They're starting to lose power to these burghers. And so what they do is they start creating what they call monopolies, which is, we'll let you be the exclusive trading partner with us, and then we'll shut everyone out, which works well if you're one of the lucky people to get the monopoly, but doesn't work well otherwise. We're starting to see the burghers send their kids to college and be trained and be just as educated as the nobility, or to be just as educated as the clergy. And so there's this democratization, and there's also this rise in money, and what's happening is the nation state, the monarchs realize they're going to lose out, so they start making wars and they start consolidating more and more of their power. The Renaissance is a period of a lot of warfare because these people are desperate to hold on to their power. We also see that with the population drop, okay, it was terrible to be a worker in the Middle Ages when you had a high population. Why? Why was it bad to have be a worker in a high population? Low wages. Why low wages?
Because you have lots of people working.
You got lots of people working. Supply and demand. Now, all these people have died off, and you're one of the last ones left. What's that going to do to your wages? They're going to go up. So people are starting to make a lot more money now. And so we're starting to see a lot of more social mobility in a lot of different ways, even as the nobility are starting to consolidate their power. All of this is going on right before, about a century or two before Luther is coming on the scene. All of these things are really important. They get overlooked. But see, Luther is a continuation of a lot of these themes. He'll end up taking them further than anyone else, but he's a continuation of them. Finally, the church is unable to keep up. I know that's a surprising thing for you to understand. Many of you might be surprised to know that even today the church is not always the most relevant place. Sometimes our web pages aren't as up to date as the major corporations. At times we can get caught up in bureaucracies. I know. It's hard to believe, but just stay with me. But this is nothing new. You see, at this time, the church is also doing that. And the church has a lot of major problems that are occurring right at this confluence. So, with all of these other shifts, the Black Death happening, with the fact that people are wanting answers and the church isn't providing them, with humanism and people trying to critique and go back to the sources before the church, the medieval church came along, with the growth of money and economic assertiveness, all of these things are challenging the church's pride of place, and right at that moment is when the church is at its most lethargic and just totally brittle. We see at this time numerous problems with the popes. The popes are fighting these internecine wars. They're trying, most of them come from the nobility of Italy. And so rather than trying to go ahead and get these, focus on church matters, they're trying to get back their family lands with church soldiers, paid for with tithes. They are having these wild parties that are embarrassing even to our modern ears. They are known for the three popes right leading up to Luther are known of some of the worst popes. Excessively concerned with worldly things, but terrible managers, which is the last thing you want to have when the church is in crisis. But there we are. Cardinals, the cardinals who are supposed to keep, they're the princes of the church. The cardinals elect the pope and they do other things. They're in charge of archbishops and they're in charge of things. They're doing terrible jobs too. Some of them are trying to assassinate popes that they don't like. Remove them. Hide them away. Back rival popes. Disorder at the highest levels. Moving down to bishops. You have three things. You have simony. Simony is the buying of a church office. That's how Albrecht of Mainz got his church office, by the way. It was supposed to be illegal under church practices, but there were bishops who weren't present in the areas that they were dioceses of. So it's kind of like you were supposed to be in the diocese of York, but you were living it up in the south of France. And then finally, you would have bishops who would control more than one territory, which was a no-no. So they're getting the revenue from one territory and another territory. Again, Archbishop of Mainz. So Luther, when he will eventually list his 95 complaints to the Roman Catholic Church, or to the Catholic Church, is going to go to one of the worst offenders, who's going to pass it on to an even worse offender, which is just statements of coming attractions. But the last thing is, of course, the immediate contact that most people had with the clergy. You had monks who were completely worthless. They were wealthy people who didn't really do much, and they collected tithes and givings into their monasteries and then hired people to tend their land. And so they made more money that way. And you never saw them, but you were told they were holy, and you would never achieve their kind of holiness. And on the other hand, you had the clergy who were out there in the world, the priests. Many of them were just as illiterate as the average person. Most of them couldn't read Latin and would botch it. In fact, we think that many of the words like hocus pocus are just horrible, pardon my language, bastardizations of Latin words. And then, on top of that, they wouldn't be able to give pastoral care very well. Culminating, even if they failed to do all the things they were supposed to do, some of them were known for charging fees or were involved in various escapades that would have been frowned on if anyone else in the community would have caused them. It was a mess. All this when the church needed to be on top of things. And so I'll leave you with this one last illustration. It's called the Great Schism. It's also called the Babylonian Captivity. And what happened was this. There was a pope. And he was afraid for his life. And he fled over to the south of France, which is a good place to flee if you're afraid for your life. I got to admit it. And he established a place in Avignon. But then the cardinals back in Rome said that's not good, and so they set up a rival pope. Now the best way to cure this, what would you say would be the best way to fix this problem? If you have two popes that are claiming to have power. Do away with one, but how are you going to do that?
Do away with both of them and start a third one.
And they did that. And it worked out exactly as you think it would work out. The third pope doesn't want to give up his power. So now you have 3 popes where you had 2 popes before. They were finally able to do it with a series of councils, but here's the thing. There was a movement called the conciliatory movement. And that's not like conciliatory, like a conciliatory letter. Conciliatory is council, of the councils. So the notion was they were going to get councils together, and the councils would have preeminence over the popes, which sounds like a fantastic idea. In fact, if they had been able to do that, we might not have had the Reformation. You would have had all the representatives of the church get together. They would have voted. They would have voted for democratically for who they wanted to install. But once the pope was installed, the last thing he wanted to do was give up power again. And so the conciliatory movement died. This will have tremendous impact later on with Luther, because the Pope moves to becoming, has 2 problems emerge from this. Number 1, the Pope is terrified about having his power questioned, because if his power is questioned, he can get removed from office just like one of those 3 popes did. And this goes on psychologically with all of the popes from there. The second thing is this. People notice. Now in the Middle Ages, think about this. God is the most important. And what is the Pope called? What are some of the other names for the Pope? Do we know?
Holy Father.
Pontiff.
Holy Father.
Pontiff.
Pontifex Maximus. Yep. One of them is the Vicar for Christ. The Vicar for Christ. Does anyone know what vicar means? I have a funny story about how I know what vicar means. So when we went away on internship, we had a lot of Episcopalians at my seminary. And they love to talk about going on the vicarage because Episcopalians love those highfalutin words. Apologies to Episcopalians out there. But they do. And so they love to be called vicar. Vicar, and I'm going on my vicarage, and for them that was their internship. Well, I never used that. But when I was called that, I would correct people and say, no, that's not a vicarage, it's an internship. And And finally, what had happened was my pastor, who was my mentor, left after a few months. He felt like he was being called from the congregation to not serve there anymore, and just was feeling that way and was called somewhere else. And so at that moment, everyone looked at me, and I'm like, I guess I'll be filling in as your pseudo pastor for the next few months. So I had someone come up and I said, okay, fine. And I looked up the dictionary. I'm like, okay, this is what a vicar is. A vicar is one who stands in vicariously for someone. Oh, goodness, I'm a vicar. So I was a vicar at that point. It's one who stands in vicariously. So let's think about this. The Pope is the vicar for Christ. That means the Pope stands in vicariously for Jesus while Jesus is away until Jesus were to come back. He is on his vicarage right now.
So it's like a power of attorney?
It is. However you want to look at it, he's standing in vicariously there. So the Pope is number one, and then the bishops, and then the kings, and then the peasants. Now, rewind back to the crisis of the three popes. Or I like to always refer to it as my three popes. I thought about getting a picture of Fred McMurray and having all three popes superimposed on the kid. I decided that was too far. But my three popes. So anyway, what happens? What happens when you see three popes arguing for this place? What do you think about the office of the papacy after that? Not much. You devalue it. He's no longer who he said he is. So these two things, there's a rigidity and a fragility of wanting to maintain your power at all costs and not have anyone attack you. And then on the other hand, everyone knows that the Pope has no clothes, as it were. Before Luther came on, there were reformers. John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe will translate the Bible into English. He will die of natural causes, and then he will be condemned as a heretic. His body will be exhumed. It will be burned at the stake after it, and then thrown into the river Swift. You also had Jan Hus. Jan Hus, who followed Wycliffe's example. Jan Hus was mentioned there. He was actually caught on the way after being given a safe passage to present his viewpoints, and then is executed because that burned at the stake as a heretic, which is why Luther was so afraid to go places, and why Luther's prince was so afraid to send him, because they knew how much a safe passage had counted in the past for Jan Hus. You also had people like, but on the other hand, you had people who were reforming. There was a Catholic priest whose name escapes me at the moment, Cisneros. And Cisneros, he founded a college at a place in Spain. He translated the Bible, the polyglot, which had 4 different languages in it: Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and Spanish when applicable. And he also made sure that he was printing devotional texts in the language of the people of Spain. You had people like Erasmus, who went ahead and he gathered up all the Greek manuscripts that he could, and he compiled them into a Greek New Testament. In fact, Luther would use this Greek New Testament when translating the Bible at the Wartburg. So these were people who stayed within Roman Catholicism and sought to reform it. What makes Luther so different? What makes Luther different from these other people?
He started a new religion.
Sort of.
He came to the conclusion you're saved by faith.
Well, that will come later on, and that is the most important conclusion he comes to. That is absolutely true. Luther was pushed. You see what happens too often, and we see this. When a group or people have power, a lot of times they try and maintain their power not through dialogue, debate, or explanation, but through raw force. And so that's what happened. But the problem was they came up against Luther, who was able to meet this institution head on and use all of the tools that were coming around, like the printing press, and his sense of being German, and use all of those to counteract the power and blind authority of the church. And so next week we'll be getting into the pictures. Next week we'll be discussing, but I want to lay the foundations of the late medieval world into which Luther existed. It was an age not unlike our own. A lot of people searching for questions. A lot of people looking to the church to answer those questions. A lot of people within the church trying to reform the church. And some people in the church being bureaucrats and stopping any kind of change, reform, or growth that might emerge. But I think today we're in a better place. I think the church at the 16th century that Luther enters into was an anomaly, because I think our churches today are much more open. And maybe that is one of the gifts of Luther. The Protestantism allowed churches to be adaptable, to respond quicker to the questions and issues of people's faith, even as it led the Spirit to behave more wildly and less in control than maybe we would like him to behave sometimes.